The heavy brass ring of the court-martial gavel crashed down against the polished oak block, and in that single brutal strike, 10 years of unbroken service, blood, and quiet sacrifices were stripped from my shoulders as if they had never existed. I stood frozen in the cold glare of the military courtroom while men who had never smelled burned powder or carried a dying comrade through the mud stripped away my rank and branded me a liar. The heavy silence in the room pressing against my chest was far more suffocating than the smoke of any firefight I had ever survived in the desolate valleys of the eastern mountains. Lieutenant Miller sat at the prosecution table with a calm and satisfied smirk on his face, knowing full well that the missing telemetry logs had been destroyed by his own hands hours before the inquiry began. My commanding officer refused to meet my gaze, staring down at his spotless uniform while the panel declared that my impossible shot was nothing more than an unauthorized civilian casualty caused by negligence. They wanted a scapegoat to cover up a catastrophic intelligence failure, and I was the easiest target available because I had spent years refusing to play their political games or bow to their arrogance. Nobody in that marble hall cared about the 3 trapped soldiers who walked out of that canyon alive, only because my bullet found its mark through the blinding dust storm. As 2 military police officers stepped forward to escort me toward the heavy steel doors, the commander leaned over the wooden bench and delivered the final blow that shattered whatever fragment of faith I had left in the system. 5 years before the gavel fell, I was just a ghost in grease-stained fatigues, carrying a Pelican case twice my size through the blistering sun of forward operating base Viper. The heat in that nameless valley was a physical weight, thick with the stench of diesel exhaust, burning trash, and stale sweat. My back burned with a dull, throbbing pain at the base of my spine, a souvenir from a brutal night jump into Hellmand that military doctors repeatedly dismissed as mere inflammation. I sat on the scuffed plastic chest under the shade of a tattered camouflage net, wrapping a oily rag around my right hand as I cleaned the bolt carrier of my heavy rifle. Footsteps crunched heavily on the gravel, carrying the unearned confidence of a fresh rotation that had stepped off the Chinooks only 12 hours prior. Task Force Viper had arrived with clean boots, crisp uniforms, and an endless supply of arrogance. 3 of them stopped at the edge of my shade, their shadows blocking the harsh light. The squad leader, a broad-shouldered lieutenant named Miller with a fresh buzz cut and spotless gear, stepped closer and tapped the tip of his boot against my foot. He looked down at my sweat-stained shirt, which bore no rank insignia or unit patches, and let out a short, dismissive laugh. He asked if I was lost or if the command staff was now letting logistics clerks clean heavy hardware, suggesting I leave the precision machinery to men who actually knew how to pull a trigger. His team chuckled behind him, making crude jokes about getting them hot coffee from the Tactical Operations Center once I finished playing with things I did not understand. I did not raise my voice, nor did I waste energy defending myself. In my world, arrogance was a self-correcting flaw, and the mountains usually collected that debt sooner or later. I simply kept scrubbing the carbon buildup from the firing pin, letting the cold silence of the desert answer for me. My journey into that quiet endurance had started long before the deployment, rooted in the harsh silence of a home where weakness was treated as a crime. My father was a retired master sergeant who looked at his daughter and saw only a failure of lineage, a fragile distraction in a family that had produced generations of infantrymen. When I signed my enlistment papers, he did not offer a blessing or a word of advice. He simply remarked that the cold would break me before the training ever did. That prediction followed me through every kilometer of road marches, every cold night in the mud, and every range where male instructors looked past me as if I were a temporary placeholder waiting to quit. During my early years in the regular infantry battalion, the disdain was subtle but constant. When I applied for the advanced marksmanship program, my application sat on a desk for 3 months while less qualified men were cleared without question. Officers openly questioned whether a woman possessed the shoulder density to absorb the violent recoil of heavy anti-materiel systems, or the mental stamina to sit in a hide site for 48 hours without breaking. I was given broken equipment, assigned to night shifts on grease pits, and left out of tactical briefings. Instead of fighting them with words, I made a silent vow to become invisible, flawless, and indispensable. While the rest of the squad slept or drank during leave, I stayed behind in the armory, learning the mechanical blueprints of every weapon system until I could assemble an Mk-13, blindfolded by touch alone. I studied atmospheric drag, wind shear, and ballistics equations until math became my second language. I trained my body to ignore pain, holding my breath between heartbeats until my trigger squeeze became as cold and mechanical as the iron frame in my hands. The quiet tension at FOB Viper reached its breaking point 3 weeks into the deployment when high-altitude intelligence reported unusual movement along the jagged limestone ridges of Sector 4. Lieutenant Miller and his team were eager to prove their worth, dismissing local reports of an elite insurgent spotter team operating in the high caves as mere rumors fed by frightened villagers. Miller pushed for aggressive foot patrols through the narrow canyon floors, convinced that heavy firepower and aggression could clear any terrain. I sat in the corner of the briefing room during those planning sessions, listening to him map out routes that exposed his men to every elevated firing position in the valley. When I pointed out that the thermal crosswinds in the canyon would render standard suppression useless and leave a patrol trapped in a kill zone, Miller cut me off in front of the entire staff, telling me to stick to counting supply crates. The tension in the room was suffocating, but the senior officers remained silent, preferring to trust the loud confidence of a male lieutenant over the quiet warnings of an unranked specialist. Late that evening, a sudden dust storm rolled over the mountains, cutting off visual reconnaissance and blinding our lower sensors. Down in the valley, a 3-man marine recon element pushed into the canyon to verify thermal signatures, completely unaware that Miller's team had failed to secure the northern ridgeline as instructed. Within minutes, the radio crackled with frantic, broken transmissions over the static. The Marines were pinned down under heavy machine gun fire from a fortified cave mouth high up the canyon wall, taking casualties with zero cover and no clear path of retreat. Inside the operations tent, panic began to take root as officers crowded around the digital map table, watching the blue tracking icons freeze in place. Air support was completely negated by the sheer canyon walls and unpredictable thermals that would shred any helicopter attempting to hover. Lieutenant Miller stood over the map table with his face pale, frantically offering excuses about shifting parameters and unmapped elevation angles. Commander Vance, a weathered veteran whose face looked as though it had been carved out of dry granite, stepped up to the board and cut through the noise, demanding to know who could place a cold-bore shot through a narrow cave opening at a distance of nearly 1,500 meters in total darkness to silence the gun. Miller hesitated, looking back at his designated marksman, who slowly shook his head, admitting that such a shot through swirling mountain crosswinds was nothing more than an impossible prayer. The room fell into an agonizing silence as the radio continued to bleed the sound of heavy fire from the canyon below. Vance looked past the sweating officers, past the tactical displays, and locked his eyes directly on the back of the tent where I stood in the shadows. He walked down the center aisle, stopped in front of me, and snapped his boots together, bringing his hand up in a crisp, slow salute that left the entire room speechless. "Master Chief," Vance said, his voice carrying through the silent tent with absolute authority, "we have a ballistics problem that only you can solve." I returned the salute with tired grace, unslung the scarred rifle from my aching shoulder, and stepped past Lieutenant Miller, whose jaw remained open in stunned silence. There was no time for satisfaction, only the heavy, cold reality of the task ahead. We boarded the Black Hawk within 10 minutes, the helicopter fighting violent mountain thermals as it banked into the freezing night air over the spine of the mountains. When my boots slammed onto the loose shale of the high Overwatch ridge, the cold wind cut through my sweat-soaked shirt, and a sharp flare of pain shot up my bad lower back. I dropped to my stomach on the frozen rock, dragging the heavy rifle into position while my spotter deployed the optics beside me. Down in the black abyss of the canyon, the cave mouth flashed yellow every few seconds as heavy round strikes pinned the surviving Marines against the bare rock wall. The distance was 1,470 meters, complicated by 3 separate wind zones swirling through the ravine below. I pressed my cheek against the frozen cheek rest of the stock, feeling my heart rate slow down as I forced the cold air into my lungs. Through the green haze of the night vision scope, I could not see the enemy shooter, only the brief, lethal bursts of fire illuminating the cave entrance. I took a slow breath, adjusted my reticle against the fierce gale tearing across the ridge, and gently squeezed the trigger. The violent roar of the rifle shattered the night, the heavy recoil slamming into my shoulder with sledgehammer force. 2 seconds passed in complete, agonizing silence as the heavy bullet tore through the dark expanse. A tiny spark flashed high against the bare rock wall above the cave. I had missed. The enemy machine gun instantly cut out, the shooter realizing he was being hunted from the opposite ridge, and the radio in my ear went dead as the seconds ticked away. The silence following the missed shot hung heavier than the freezing mountain air. Beside me, Miller's breathing was sharp through the headset as he squinted into his spotting scope, his voice tight and clipped as he gave me the call-out. The bullet had caught an unexpected thermal pocket rising from the canyon floor, sailing high and right to strike the limestone overhang. Down in the darkness of the cave, the heavy machine gun had gone completely dark, its operator spooked by the sudden strike of high-caliber lead against the rock wall. I did not curse, nor did I allow my heart rate to spike beyond the slow, steady rhythm I had spent years mastering. I smoothly cycled the bolt, ejecting the hot brass casing into the loose shale with a soft, metallic click, and stripped a fresh round into the chamber. The enemy gunner was an experienced mountain fighter. He knew that a sniper on the opposite ridge meant he had only seconds before the next round was dialed in, but he also knew that the Marine recon team was pinned down in the dry riverbed below, and if he did not resume suppression fire before they broke cover, his position would be overrun. He was going to peak. Arrogance and necessity would force him back to the spade grip of that heavy weapon, resting on the assumption that no human shooter could adjust for complex mountain crosswinds in total darkness after a single missed attempt. Through the harsh green tint of my optics, I watched the mouth of the cave. I shifted my reticle, holding lower and further to the left to compensate for the thermal updraft that had claimed my first shot. 10 seconds passed, stretched long by the agonizing sound of quiet radio static from the Marines dying down in the canyon. Then, a brief flicker of movement cut through the black shadow of the cave entrance, the faint thermal signature of a man stepping back into the firing pocket. I did not wait for the flash of his muzzle this time. I anticipated the breath between his decision to fire and the mechanical pull of his trigger. Exhaling half a lungful of cold air, I let my index finger break the sear with a smooth, subconscious pressure. The rifle roared again, sending another 300-grain projectile screaming through the freezing dark. 2.4 seconds later, there was no spark against the rock wall. Through the optic, I saw a momentary interruption in the cave's thermal profile as the shape standing behind the machine gun collapsed forward, draping heavily over the hot barrel of the DSHK. The weapon went permanently silent. Below, the Marine recon team realized the heavy gun had been silenced, breaking into a frantic sprint down the dry riverbed toward the extraction point, while their radio operator yelled frantic blessings to the unknown overwatch element on the ridge. We cleared the peak before the sun crested the horizon, returning to FOB Viper aboard a Blackhawk that smelled of cold aviation fuel and dust. When my boots hit the gravel near the armory, Lieutenant Miller and his team were standing near the tactical operations tent, holding half-burned cigarettes in the pale morning light. The news of the long-range kill had already bounced across the radio frequencies, leaving the entire command post in stunned disbelief. As I dragged my Pelican case past them, covered in grit and carbon with my face streaked with sweat, Lieutenant Miller opened his mouth as if to deliver a rehearsed line or a stiff apology. I did not look at him. I gave him no eye contact, no nod of acknowledgement, and no opportunity to wash away his earlier condescension with cheap words. Sensing the total absence of ego in my demeanor, Miller slowly stepped back, snapping his jaw shut and bringing himself to rigid attention alongside his men as I passed. Yet, the quiet respect of the forward base was short-lived once we rotated back to the main headquarters 6 months later. Lieutenant Miller was not a man built to endure humiliation. In the official after-action report submitted to Division Command, the successful canyon strike was reclassified under his unit's tactical oversight. He began crafting a subtle, dangerous narrative that the engagement had been an unauthorized, reckless risk taken by an unranked asset who had ignored established sector protocols, resulting in collateral damage to an empty civilian shelter located deeper in the canyon. I discovered the anomaly 3 months after returning to stateside headquarters while reviewing the digital ballistics logs in the unit archive. The telemetry data recorded by the high-altitude surveillance drone during that night operation, the very data proving that my line of fire was clear of civilian structures and directly neutralized an active enemy position, had been flagged as corrupted and quietly purged from the central server. When I brought the missing records to the attention of the battalion intelligence officer, I was met with a wall of bureaucratic hostility. The files were locked under security clearances I no longer possessed, and the access logs showed that the last modification had been signed off using Lieutenant Miller's administrative credentials. He was laying the groundwork to erase my contribution entirely while framing me for an alleged breach of engagement rules to advance his own promotion track. I knew that confronting him directly within the chain of command would be useless without physical proof. I began conducting my own quiet investigation during night shifts, cross-referencing auxiliary radio transcripts, fuel logs, and telemetry backups stored on isolated hardware units in the maintenance depot. I slowly pieced together a paper trail showing that Miller had systematically altered battle damage assessments across 3 separate operations to hide his own tactical failures and cover up unauthorized munitions expenditures. The turning point came when I discovered a secondary flash drive hidden inside an archived flight recording from the extraction helicopter, containing raw, unedited thermal footage of the canyon strike with hard-coded timestamps. But before I could secure the file for formal submission to the Inspector General, someone tipped off Miller's circle. The following morning, my personal quarters were searched under the guise of a routine security inspection, and a set of classified targeting documents, conveniently planted among my personal gear, was recovered by military police. Within 48 hours, I was placed under formal arrest, charged with theft of classified material, falsification of combat reports, and gross negligence in the field. They took my badges, restricted my movement, and scheduled a formal court-martial designed to bury the truth permanently before I could ever present the extracted data to an impartial board. The formal court-martial proceeded like a carefully scripted play where the outcome had been decided before the first witness took the stand. Lieutenant Miller sat at the prosecution table in a crisp, spotless dress uniform, delivering his testimony with practiced conviction. He painted a picture of an insubordinate, rogue operator who consistently bypassed authority, ignored clear rules of engagement, and fabricated performance metrics to cover up reckless actions in the field. He claimed that the canyon operation was an unapproved risk that put friendly forces in jeopardy and resulted in the destruction of non-military structures, pointing to the sanitized intelligence reports as absolute proof. When my defense representative pressed Miller on the missing drone telemetry logs, the prosecution smoothly produced certified digital affidavits claiming the corruption was due to hardware failure caused by dust storms. Every attempt to present my side of the story was met with procedural objections that were promptly sustained by the military judge. The long hours I had spent serving quietly in the shadows counted for nothing against the polished credentials and political backing of an officer connected to high-ranking brass. The panels saw what they were instructed to see: a solitary female soldier who had stepped out of her designated line and caused an operational failure. When the final verdict of guilty was read, I did not cry out or beg for leniency. I stood erect at the defense table, holding my head high while the panel stripped my rank, docked my pay, and issued a bad conduct discharge to ensure my military career ended in disgrace. Miller gave me a subtle, victorious smile as I was led away in hand restraints, confident that he had successfully buried the truth beneath a mountain of official paperwork and broken my spirit forever. He believed that taking my uniform meant taking my power, unaware that my identity had never been defined by the metal pins on my collar. Following my release and exit from active service, I did not wallow in bitterness or seek loud, reckless confrontation. I retreated to a small mountain town 3 hours from the base, taking a low-profile job as a gunsmith in a quiet precision arms shop. I built a modest life centered around silence, discipline, and absolute focus, working on custom long-range rifles for civilian shooters while continuing my work behind the scenes. Every evening after the shop closed, I sat at my workbench with the encrypted laptop, methodically dissecting every public record, Freedom of Information file, and archived signal transfer related to Task Force Viper. Justice is not a burst of raw emotion. It is a mechanical process built on patience, precision, and unyielding leverage. Over 2 years, I traced the digital signatures on the altered battle damage assessments to an unsecured server, hosted by a private defense contractor that Miller's family had financial stakes in. The altered records were not just used to frame me. They were part of a systemic fraud scheme designed to hide missing equipment, overbill the government for unfulfilled munitions contracts, and cover up tactical errors across multiple deployments. Instead of going to the media or leaking fragments of information online, I compiled an indisputable 500-page audit backed by recovered raw flight footage, hard-coded time-stamped satellite backups, and financial cross-references. I sent the complete package directly to the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General, the Armed Services Committee, and federal prosecutors simultaneously, leaving zero room for local command figures to suppress the file. Attached to the cover page was a single, unedited video clip, the high-definition thermal recording of the canyon strike, showing my bullet striking the active enemy DSK position at 1,470 meters, followed by the safe extraction of the trapped marine element. The response was swift, silent, and crushing. Federal investigators opened a wide-ranging inquiry into Task Force Viper's administrative command, pulling server drives and subpoenaing financial records that Miller could no longer delete. The digital paper trail led straight to Miller and 2 senior officers who had signed off on the altered reports in exchange for lucrative post-service consulting promises. 4 months after the file was delivered, I received an official summons to appear at the federal courthouse in the Capitol. As I walked into the grand hallway wearing a tailored civilian suit, I saw Lieutenant Miller, now stripped of his assignment and dressed in a dark prisoner jumpsuit, being led down the corridor in heavy iron restraints by federal marshals. He looked pale, gaunt, and completely broken by the weight of charges that included fraud, falsification of official records, and obstruction of justice. He stopped as he saw me standing near the marble pillars. For the first time in 7 years, he truly looked at me, not as a nameless clerk, an unranked distraction, or a target for scapegoating, but as the master shooter who had quietly calculated his downfall with the same cold precision used on the ridge. I did not taunt him, smile, or say a word. I simply met his eyes with a steady, unblinking gaze as the marshals escorted him away to face decades in federal prison. 3 weeks after the federal court handed down Miller's conviction, an official wooden box arrived at my modest workshop, accompanied by a heavy envelope carrying the seal of the Department of Defense. Inside was a full formal exoneration, a complete restoration of my military record to honorable status, and the retroactively awarded Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in the canyon. The paperwork was signed directly by the Secretary of Defense, formally striking the court-martial from the archives as if it had never occurred. I did not hold a celebration, nor did I post the news for public praise. I simply took the medal, wrapped it in a velvet cloth, and placed it inside the scuffed pelican case that had traveled with me through the dust of FOB Viper. The vindication did not stem from the piece of bronze metal or the official signatures on parchment. It came from the knowledge that truth, when backed by unrelenting discipline, operates under the same absolute laws of physics as a bullet in flight. It will always find its target regardless of the wind or the noise trying to blow it off course. A few days later, a black civilian SUV pulled up to the shop, stopping near the open garage door where I was assembling a custom barrel. Commander Vance stepped out, looking older, his hair completely silver, but carrying the same calm, unyielding presence he had in the tactical operations tent. He did not offer a grand speech or clumsy excuses for the system that had failed me years ago. He walked up to the workbench, picked up a finished bolt assembly, examined the smooth polish with an expert eye, and laid it back down with quiet respect. Vance looked at me and said that the 3 Marines who walked out of that canyon were all alive, raising families, and running a veteran foundation. He told me that every year on the anniversary of that night, they toast to an unknown Overwatch shooter who saved their lives when everyone else called it an impossible prayer. Vance handed me an invitation to an annual gathering of retired Special Operations veterans, assuring me that my place at the table was permanent whenever I chose to claim it. I thanked him quietly, shook his hand as an equal, and watched him drive away into the afternoon sun. That evening, I walked up to the high ridge behind my shop, carrying my long-range rifle slung across my shoulder. The cold mountain wind swept through the pines, howling through the peaks just like the thermals in the eastern valleys. The dull ache at the base of my spine was still there, a permanent reminder of the ground I had carried and the path I had walked. But for the first time in 10 years, the heavy weight in my chest was completely gone. I sat on a flat limestone rock overlooking the valley below, watching the sun dip past the horizon, casting deep, bruised purple shadows across the landscape. I unslung the rifle, checked the receiver, and popped the covers off the glass, taking in the wide, peaceful expanse before me. I didn't need to prove anything to the world anymore. I had reclaimed my name, restored my dignity, and set my own boundaries on my own terms. As the stars began to pinhole the dark blue sky, I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp air, finally feeling at total peace with the silence.